Sometimes the most rational decision looks too simple to believe. Not loud success, not a sharp turn, not running somewhere far away, but the opposite, a step toward simplification. To live more simply, not as a slogan, not as a trend, but as an inner decision. Because if you honestly look at your life, it becomes clear. What exhausts us is not life itself, but the amount of excess we have piled onto it. We live in a world where it constantly feels like we need more, achieve more, have more, match more expectations from ourselves, from others, from the future. And at some point, this more begins to weigh on you. You seem to be doing everything right, trying, moving forward. And yet inside there is tension, as if life is always playing too loudly, and you cannot turn the volume down. In this sense, simplicity is not a rejection of life. It is a rejection of unnecessary noise. It is the moment when you stop constantly proving something and begin to honestly ask yourself, do I actually need this? Not the world, not the people around you, not someone else's expectations, but you. And this question often turns out to be unexpectedly difficult, because we have lived in I must mode for so long that we have forgotten how I want, and this is enough sound. When expectations decrease, a strange feeling of relief appears, as if you finally stop running with a heavy backpack filled with other people's demands. You do not have to be productive all the time. You do not have to constantly develop. You do not have to match someone's image of a successful life. Simplicity begins right here, with allowing yourself not to complicate things. Less excess is not about asceticism or giving up joy. It is about clarity. When there are fewer things, fewer decisions, fewer roles, there is more quiet inside. You begin to hear yourself better. You understand what truly brings calm and what only drains your energy. And often it turns out that the simplest things, sleep, proper food, unstrained conversations, walks, silence, give more than all the complex structures we have built over the years. We rarely notice how much constant noise destabilizes us: informational, emotional, social. Opinions, comparisons, other people's lives that seem supposedly better. A simple life is when you consciously remove part of this noise. Not because you are weak or tired, but because you are rational. Because you understand that stability does not begin with controlling the whole world, but with reducing the amount of what influences you. And this is where inner calm appears, not as permanent happiness, not as the absence of problems, but as a sense of grounding. You know where your energy goes. You know what matters to you. You're not torn between hundreds of options because you have chosen a few, but they are yours. And in that choice, a kind of stability emerges that is so often missing in a complex, overloaded life. To live simply means to live more honestly, with yourself, with your capacities, with your rhythm. It is not a step back and not a defeat. It is a strategy, calm, mature, and deeply human. And perhaps this is where the kind of life begins in which it truly becomes easier to breathe. When you start living more simply, the constant feeling that you are missing out gradually disappears. That feeling used to push you to run faster, to chase opportunities, to agree to what is unnecessary. And then suddenly comes the realization. If you are always afraid of missing something, it means you are never truly present anywhere. Simplicity brings you back to the present moment. You are no longer torn between who you should become and who you already are. You are simply here. It becomes clear how many decisions we make automatically, without even questioning them. We agree because it is uncomfortable to refuse. We buy because it is expected. We take on more than we need because, what if things get worse later? A simple life is when you pause before each of these steps and calmly ask yourself, will this actually improve my life, or will it just add another burden? And if you answer honestly, a lot of things fall away on their own. As excess decreases, emotional stability appears. Not because emotions disappear, but because they stop being shaken by every external stimulus. You depend less on approval, on others' reactions, on constant evaluation. Your sense of worth no longer fluctuates with successes and failures. It becomes something calmer and more stable. You know who you are, even when nothing special is happening. Simplicity teaches you to accept life as it is, not as resignation, but as respect for reality. You stop fighting what you cannot change and direct your energy toward what you actually can. This brings a sense of inner strength, quiet, without display. Over time, you begin to notice that you need much less than you once thought. Fewer stimuli, fewer external confirmations, fewer complicated explanations. You stop searching for meaning in endless goals because you start finding it in the process of living itself, in ordinary days, in familiar routines, in simple moments that used to pass unnoticed. Most importantly, simplicity restores a sense of measure. You no longer try to live at the limit. You don't squeeze the maximum out of yourself or turn every area of life into a project. You allow yourself to be a living person, not a function, with fatigue, doubts, pauses. And in this, a quiet sense of rightness emerges. To live simply means to stop complicating what does not need to be complicated. It means choosing clarity over chaos, silence over noise, sufficiency over endless pursuit. This does not make life smaller. On the contrary, it becomes deeper. At some point you realize the most resumna decision you made was allowing yourself to live more lightly. Gradually, another important feeling appears. You are no longer in a hurry to live. It once seemed that if you stopped, something would break, that you would fall behind, drop out of the flow. But now it becomes clear. Nothing collapses. The world does not speed up because you paused, and life does not punish you for choosing to move at your own pace. On the contrary, it is in this pace that you gain the ability to notice what is actually happening within you. You begin to feel the difference between fatigue and burnout, between desire and habit, between a real need and an imposed goal. These distinctions used to get lost in constant haste. Simplicity brings things into focus. Everything becomes clearer, more honest, without unnecessary justifications. You no longer convince yourself that you are fine when you are not. You stop chasing what does not resonate with you just because it is expected. In a simple life, there is less drama. Not because everything is perfect, but because you stop turning every event into a story about yourself. Not every word is an attack, not every mistake is a catastrophe, not every deviation from the plan is a failure. You allow things to be what they are, without loading them with excess meaning. And this is unexpectedly liberating. Over time, you notice that relationships change as well. What remains are those with whom you can be yourself, without tension, without performance, without constant self-monitoring, without the need to conform. Simplicity does not destroy connections, it filters them. And although this may feel unsettling at first, later comes the understanding. Quality matters more than quantity. A few genuine warm connections provide more grounding than dozens of superficial ones. You begin to relate to the future differently. It no longer feels like an exam you must pass perfectly. It becomes a continuation of the present, not an escape from it. You do not build grand expectations, but you also do not devalue tomorrow. You simply do what you can today, and that turns out to be enough. A simple life teaches patience, not passive waiting, but a calm trust in the process. You realize that not everything is resolved quickly, and not everything requires an immediate answer. Some things take time to unfold. Some questions reveal themselves only when you stop forcing solutions. And in that, there is a deep inner calm. At a certain point, you catch yourself thinking that it has become easier to be alone. Not because of detachment, but because the constant noise inside is gone. Silence stops being frightening. It becomes a place where you can recover, gather yourself, feel grounded. You no longer seek constant distractions, because you are no longer running from yourself. And then simplicity stops being a choice. It becomes a natural state. You are not following rules of minimalism, not counting steps, not striving for some ideal version of a calm life. You simply live a bit slower, a bit more attentively, and much more honestly. And in that, without loud words or sharp turns, comes the feeling that you are finally in your place. Over time, you begin to notice another quiet shift. The constant inner tension fades, as if you always owed something to someone. Before, that feeling was a background. You must meet expectations, justify yourself, be normal, successful, composed. But as life becomes simpler, this pressure gradually weakens. You still try, you still move forward, but without the inner whip. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. You stop constantly comparing yourself to others. Not because you are above it, but because comparison loses its meaning. Everyone has their own rhythm, their own circumstances, their own limits. When you accept simplicity, you no longer measure your life by someone else's standards. You look at it from within, and that changes everything. Even failures stop looking like proof of your inadequacy. They become simply part of the path, not a verdict. A space for silence appears inside, not emptiness but space. Where everything was once crowded with thoughts, plans, anxieties, there are now pauses. And in these pauses you begin to feel alive. Not in moments of intense emotion, not at the peak of events, but in ordinary calm states. It is a very simple, almost imperceptible feeling, but it is exactly what gives a sense of stability. You begin to understand your boundaries better, not the kind that must be defended with aggression, but those that simply exist. You no longer agree automatically, not because you have become harsher, but because you have become more attentive to yourself. You sense where your energy ends and stop pretending that it is endless. There is no weakness in this. There is maturity. Simplicity also changes your relationship with mistakes. They no longer feel like something shameful that must be hidden or corrected at any cost. Mistakes become signals. They show where you went off track, where you overloaded yourself, where you stopped listening. And you do not punish yourself for them. You simply adjust your course. Calmly, without drama. You begin to value predictability. Before it seemed boring, almost frightening. It felt like life had to be intense, bright, constantly surprising. Now you see stability as support. Routine, familiar rituals, repeated days stop being enemies. They become the framework that holds your energy and your mind. In a simple life, there are fewer sharp fluctuations. You do not rise too high or fall too low. Emotions become steadier, reactions calmer. You do not live in constant ojidani of the next blow or the next triumph. You simply live what is. And in that, a surprising sense of safety appears, one that does not depend on external conditions. Gradually, you realize that simplicity is not about limitation. It is about choice. You choose not to overload yourself. You choose not to complicate what is already clear. You choose not to spend your life chasing the feeling that someday it will finally be enough. Because enough is not a point in the future. It is a state you can feel right now. And at some point, you catch yourself thinking something simple. You no longer need to prove that your life has value. It already has value, because you are present in it, because you feel, choose, and live at your own pace. This thought does not bring euphoria. It brings calm, quiet, steady, and very real. Eventually you stop searching for some final point where everything will finally be right. You no longer wait for the perfect moment, the perfect state, the perfect version of yourself. Simplicity gently leads you to understand that life does not have to form a beautiful story. It can be uneven, at times boring, at times difficult, and still remain real and valuable. You begin to trust yourself, not loudly or with overconfidence, but calmly. You know you will manage, even if things do not go according to plan, even if it becomes frightening, unclear, or hard. This trust does not come from success, but from the experience of treating yourself with care, from no longer abandoning yourself in pursuit of something external. A simple life gradually removes the illusion that happiness is a constant state. You stop demanding happiness from yourself. And paradoxically, this is when more warm, calm moments begin to appear, the kind that are real joy. Not flashes, not excitement, but a quiet sense that right now, everything is in its place. You look at your life without a magnifying glass. You do not search for problems where there are none. You do not wind yourself up with thoughts that things should be better. You understand that some days are simply ordinary, and in those ordinary days, a kind of stability appears that had been missing before. It is also important that simplicity makes you gentler toward others. When you stop putting pressure on yourself, you stop putting pressure on those around you. You expect less, demand less, become less disappointed. You begin to see people as living, imperfect beings, not as roles or functions, and your attitude becomes warmer and more honest. You no longer try to fill every pause. You no longer strive to always be busy, useful, significant. You allow yourself to simply be. And in this simple being, a depth appears that was not there in constant activity. You begin to feel life not as a task, but as a process. It becomes clear that much of what once seemed important was just noise. Not because it was bad, but because it was not yours. And you do not blame yourself for the past. You understand that you did the best you could with the level of awareness you had at the time. Simplicity is not about regret, it is about acceptance. At some point, you stop explaining your choices. You do not justify a calm life, the absence of ambition, the desire for quiet. You simply live in the way that feels right to you, and this brings a surprising sense of freedom, without struggle, without the need to prove anything. If you sum it all up very simply, without big words, it comes down to one thing. A simple life is when you are not running from yourself and not fighting reality. When you choose clarity over overload, honesty over tension, and sufficiency over endless pursuit. It does not make you special. It makes you calm. And perhaps that is the most reasonable decision you can make. Not to complicate things, not to demand the impossible from life, not to waste energy on the unnecessary, but simply to live attentively, quietly, and authentically.